March 1945, west banks of the Rhine. German officers watched the murky water with quiet confidence. For them, Germany's largest river was still a natural ally. The crossing there would require weeks, perhaps months. The Allies would have to build bridges under fire, as always. And as always, they would be repelled. That was what the doctrine said. It was what guaranteed the past. That was what General Alfred Schlemm believed, until he saw wheels rise out of the water. The American thesis, however, did not follow bridges. It followed numbers, production, and geometry. While the Germans dug trenches, the Americans manufactured DUKWs, amphibious trucks, boats with wheels, contraptions ridiculed by the Wehrmacht, but created by an industry that didn't laugh, just deliver. That night on the Rhine was not won by armor. It was won by logistics. This video reconstructs with technical precision and strategic irony the moment when the last major German line of defense was ignored by an army that no longer had to wait, nor by bridges, nor by traditional logic. The defenders of the Rhine expected a frontal assault. They received an invisible collapse. And when they realized, it was too late, because the impossible was swimming. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any trench. By March 1945, the Germans estimated that the Americans had a maximum of 100 operational amphibious vehicles. 100. On the day of the crossing of the Rhine, there were more than 2,000, not in theory, on the go, at dozens of simultaneous points, in a continuous line, transporting men, ammunition, fuel, radios, howitzers, and even mobile kitchens, straight into Germany. No bridge was needed, no break allowed. In just 3 days, the largest river in Western Europe lost its defensive value. The question remains, how does a power so obsessed with defense just didn't see it coming? If you value this type of research with real numbers, military documents, and strategic analysis, leave your support. This helps this channel keep the memory of history alive and reveal the details it almost hid. For the German command, the Rhine was more than a river. It was a sacred line, a millennial frontier that had protected the Germanic empires since the Napoleonic Wars. No enemy crossed the Rhine easily, and almost none attempted under fire. In 1945, this illusion still underpinned a vital part of the Reich's defensive doctrine. The Wehrmacht, already under pressure from all sides, believed that the Rhine offered a last breath, a natural interval before total destruction. The banks were hastily fortified, dynamited bridges, troops repositioned. And based on everything they had learned in World War I and in the fighting at Stalingrad and Normandy, there was one certainty shared among the officers. Any crossing would take time, days, maybe weeks. This would give them room to react, room to reorganize defenses, and maybe even counterattack. It was a blind belief, an echo of doctrines of the previous century, applied to a war that no longer obeyed maps or manuals. The irony is that this faith in the Rhine was not just strategic, it was almost spiritual. The German command called the river the last natural wall. Letters from soldiers referred to it as der eiserne Strom, the iron flow. For many officers, it would be impossible for a modern army to cross that obstacle with speed. The barges were slow, bridges, easy targets. The night crossing, unthinkable. The Rhine, in its width and stream, was still seen as an invincible shield. And it was this blind trust underpinned by historical myths that prevented the Germans from seeing what was brewing on the other side of the bank. Not a battalion, not a platoon, but a machine. Because what was approaching was not an ordinary force. It was the epitome of American industry at war. The crossing of the Rhine was not a classic military operation. It was a logistical operation, coordinated, timed, and supplied with factory precision. More than 2,000 DUKWs, hundreds of LCVPs, dozens of gliders, and thousands of tons of supplies were ready to cross in a 72-hour window. The Americans did not plan to make their way with explosions. They planned to float over German pride, in operational silence, as naturally as they distributed ration at the front. While German officers were still discussing where to build mobile defenses, U.S. Fifth Army engineers had already plotted more than 30 simultaneous crossing points, each with a schedule, designated fleet and air support. They didn't expect a breach in the defense. They created their own gaps. The American doctrine, based on the multiplication of means, completely nullified the traditional surprise factor. It was not a one-time scam. It was a systemic collapse, unthinkable in the centralized doctrine of the Wehrmacht. And it was precisely this difference in thought that generated the fatal error. The Germans were still looking for bridges, but the Americans no longer needed them. What Germany was hoping for was a recycled version of the crossing of the Somme or the Seine, and so it prepared itself with trenches, saturation artillery, and fortified points. But none of these defenses would work against an enemy that turned trucks into vessels. The DUKW did not need to wait for aerial cover, nor to install floating structures. He would just get into the water and keep going. This is where the statistical shock arises. The whole of Germany in 1944 produced just over 3,000 floating military transport vehicles. The US, in the same period, produced more than 21,000 in the amphibious transport category alone, 7 times more, in silence. No advertising, quietly. That was the difference in philosophy. While the Germans were looking for the ideal machine, the Americans were making enough of the machine, on an industrial scale. If this number surprised you, write in the comments. Logistics wins. Because in this case, she didn't just win. It drowned out the enemy doctrine. The result was a moment of absolute mental displacement. One of the captured diaries of a German officer of the 11th Panzer Division describes it thus: "The river was crossed without a fight. We didn't hear any gunshots, motors only. When we realized, they were already behind us." This phrase reveals something deeper than defeat. It reveals disorientation. The crossing did not happen as the Germans had hoped. It did not involve visible bravery. He did not follow the rituals expected of a battle. It just happened, like a steady stream of gears. German doctrine, based on the idea of fixed points of defense, was never designed to handle multiple simultaneous crossings. By waiting for a centralized attack, they prepared for the wrong enemy. The Rhine, with all its breadth and depth, was ignored as an obstacle. The water, which should have prevented the passage, became a road. And the trucks, which were supposed to stop on the bank, kept moving. But the most ironic was yet to come. Because even in the face of this logistical avalanche, many officers still refused to believe what they saw. In post-war interrogations, some even suggested that the Americans had built invisible bridges. Others assumed that they had been betrayed by local collaborators. The truth was simpler and more devastating. Germany underestimated America's ability to turn every bolt into a strategic advantage. However, the crossing of the Rhine was not the first warning. In other theaters, signs had already emerged. DUKWs had previously operated in Italy, the Pacific, and Normandy, but German doctrine classified these uses as tactical exceptions, a misread, a mistake that would be costly. Because if at first these vehicles seemed like improvised contraptions, now they showed their real purpose: to ignore traditional warfare, reset the geometry of the battlefield. American engineering was not interested in beauty or symmetry. She was interested in raw functionality, and she applied it with surgical precision to the banks of the Rhine. And if the Rhine was considered the last impassable line, what would come after this crossing? What kind of doctrine would allow the Americans to advance so quickly without depending on the luck or hesitation of the enemy? The answer begins to take shape in the next stage, when the German defense structure itself collapses under the weight of a doctrine it did not understand, because what the Germans called the front line, for the Americans, was just the next point on the supply schedule. The German doctrine of river defense was meticulous, rigid, sequential, and based on historical crossing patterns. First came the bombardments to silence the enemy batteries. Then, small reconnaissance barges. Next, engineers tried to establish a bridgehead under fire. Only then did the assembly of the pontoon bridges begin, which would allow the passage of the armored vehicles. Each phase was vulnerable, dependent on the previous one, and time-consuming, something that, by 1945, the Reich no longer possessed. The defenders were prepared to break this ritual. They had trained to hit fragile vessels, destroy unfinished bridges, interrupt supplies at the most critical moment. But none of this happened, not because the Allies failed in the plan, but because they ignored the entire plan. The American crossing of the Rhine did not follow a sequence. It occurred simultaneously. The DUKWs did not expect bombardments. They did not wait for bridgeheads. They crossed with artillery, with radios, with soldiers and supplies, all at the same time. What the Germans had hoped for, fragmented, came complete. German doctrine, shaped by decades of continental war theory, was designed to react, to predict, delay, counterattack. But how to react when there is no break? When is there no pause between the first shot and the arrival of supplies in the rear? The German defensive system collapsed, not because it was weak, but because it was ignored. The Americans did not break the line. They circumvented it, neutralized it, and replaced it with a new logic. The Germanic doctrine believed in obstacles. American doctrine believed in fluidity. This was even manifested in cartography. German maps marked the main crossing points as mandatory passages. Defense plans concentrated artillery at these locations, positioned mobile reserves at close range, and organized communications around these forecasts. But the DUKWs did not respect these routes. They crossed in unlikely places where there was no road, no clear field of vision, and more, with such a number of vehicles that, even where they were targeted, the flows continued. A DUKW hit did not stop the operation. It just came out of the water and was replaced in minutes. The redundancy of American industry allowed for this. They did not depend on an ideal plan. They depended on the quantity. For Germany, this was incomprehensible. The Wehrmacht's crossing doctrine was meant to protect scarce resources. Each bridge set up was a jewel, built under fire, defended with sacrifice. Each advance was precious, heavy, designed to last. But the crossing of the Rhine was almost disposable. The Americans had so many DUKWs that they could lose them without embezzling the operation. They had so many crossing points that they did not depend on success at all. The war had changed scale, of concept, of logic, and the Germans were still playing by the old rules. The defense orders kept coming in with obsolete terms. Concentrate fire on the first wave. Wait for engineering attempt. Stop bridge installation. But there was no first wave. There was no engineering. There was no bridge. The crossing was the final operation. When the Germans realized that something had crossed the river, they were already surrounded. An officer of the 7th Volksgrenadier Division wrote in his diary, "We woke up to the news that they were already behind us. We didn't hear from any engineers, no opening shot, just the sound of wet tires and orders in English." This doctrinal collapse also affected morals. Soldiers trained to recognize patterns became disoriented. They fired at places where barges were waiting, but saw armored vehicles passing at speed. The minefields were bypassed by amphibious routes. The river defenses, designed to contain an escalation, were crossed in a straight line. Nothing they had learned applied. War, which until then had obeyed predictable stages, became a continuous flow, where time ceased to be an ally and became an unaffordable luxury. And there was also the strategic depth of error. German doctrine provided that once the crossing was made, the Allies would take days to build minimum infrastructure to fuel the advance. This would allow time to deploy panzer divisions, reorganize communications, and launch counterattacks. But the DUKWs destroyed that logic as well. By crossing with ammunition, fuel, equipment, and even radios, the Americans eliminated the stabilization phase. They were already complete, already ready. Each crossing was a command post. Each opposite bank, a new starting point. The consequence of this was brutal. Within 24 hours, the Rhine had gone from being a defensive line to an enemy rearguard. What was once planned as a final shield has become an infiltration point. German forces were unable to regroup. They couldn't even understand what was happening. Worse, when the reserves began to move, they already encountered logistical roadblocks set up by the DUKWs themselves. American mobility did not stop at the crossing. It started there. It was in this context that the first reports of desertion without combat emerged. Soldiers who abandoned positions when they saw amphibious trucks emerge from the water, already armed, already in formation, already with radio and air support connected. The doctrine did not foresee this scenario. And without doctrine, what was left was panic. But there was something even more symbolic about to happen. A break in logic, not only operational, but visual. Something that no German general expected to find. Because in addition to trucks, in addition to soldiers, what was coming, literally floating, was the United States Navy, and not at sea, but in the middle of Germany. The year was 1942. The Massachusetts coast had become a makeshift testing ground where war met civil engineering. It all started with a prosaic logistical problem: a stranded ship, loaded with ammunition, with no quick access to the coast. Traditional methods were slow, dangerous, and required infrastructure that didn't exist. The Navy needed a solution, and fast. But what presented itself as an operational dilemma would give rise to one of the most underrated innovations of World War II. The answer came from the U.S. Army's Office of Research and Development, a vehicle that could travel on land but also cross bodies of water with stability and load. It was not a new concept, but it had never been done on an industrial scale, with mechanical simplicity and production speed. The idea was bold: to fuse a 2.5-ton truck with a light vessel hull. That was the birth of the DUKW, an acronym for the manufacturing code: D for 1942, U for amphibious utility, K for six-wheel drive, W for two steerable rear axles. But for the soldiers, he would soon gain another name: Duck. Duck, because, like the animal, the vehicle was moving and swam. The first prototype was ready in just 38 days, an absolute record. The hull was made of lightweight naval steel, thick enough to withstand low-intensity impact, but still flexible to maintain buoyancy even with damage. The engine came straight from the GMC CCKW truck, with all-wheel drive and the ability to tackle inclines of up to 60%. At the rear, a propeller coupled to the transmission system allowed water displacement with rudder control, while the front of the vehicle could be used as an improvised landing ramp. But the most subtle innovation was in the tires. The DUKW could inflate and deflate tires on the move, adapting to varied terrain nonstop, a critical capability when operating under fire, going straight out of the water into sand, mud, or asphalt. At first, the military hesitated. The Navy found him strange. The Army, fragile. Ford refused manufacturing. It was General Motors, through the Yellow Truck and Coach Division, that took the risk. With direct government support and freedom to adapt civilian components, production accelerated. In less than 2 years, more than 21,000 units had been delivered. And more than that, standardized, easy to maintain and operate, with parts interchangeable with other models in the American logistics line. It was a dream for any tactical commander, a nightmare for any river defender. The DUKW was created as a coastal transport and rescue tool, but quickly his function evolved. At Anzio, he carried ammunition under fire. In Normandy, he landed troops directly on the beach. In the Pacific, it took light artillery between islands, and with each mission the vehicle gained improvements: additional armor, watertight compartments, radio support, night navigation capability. What began as an emergency solution had become a modular warfare platform. It wasn't pretty, it was not elegant, but it worked, and it was always present where logistics seemed impossible. In Germany, however, almost none of this was known. Wehrmacht intelligence considered the DUKW to be a beach resource, ineffective in deep rivers and vulnerable in river operations. A 1944 report classified it as a light support vehicle with no direct offensive application. They did not predict its evolution, and even less its quantity. For German military doctrine, a floating vehicle could not replace classical engineering. But the Americans did not use it as a substitute. They used it as an overcoming. DUKW eliminated phases, mixed functions, and accelerated decisions. He didn't have to wait. He just followed. The DUKW's true strength was not in its armor, speed, or firepower, all modest. It was in their ability to exist en masse, in its ubiquity, in transforming margins into paths. American industrial production, capable of generating hundreds a week, has made every river, every lake, every beach a possible point of advancement. The DUKW represented what Germany feared most and understood least: the conversion of civilian industry into a war machine without glamour, without heroes, but with results. A single duck could carry half a ton of ammunition, 3 soldiers with full equipment, 2 long-range radios, and still maintain communication with air units. When grouped into convoys, they formed a floating network of support, refueling, and deep penetration. No linear defense plan resisted this. This flexibility shocked German observers. A commander of the 15th Division reported that he saw a truck emerge from the water and head towards the forest as if it were a road. The scene seemed absurd, but that was exactly the point. The DUKW did not respect traditional geography. He did not obey limits. and so it was incomprehensible within the Wehrmacht's doctrine of river containment. He did not need a vanguard, nor a rear guard. It was both at the same time. And when multiplied by thousands, it became a vector of total transformation of the theater of operations. By the end of the war, logistical records revealed a number that few Germans knew. By March 1945, the U.S. had more operational DUKW vehicles in Europe than Germany had, of functional tanks on the entire Western Front. This proportion was the final portrait of the conflict. While the Reich concentrated efforts on decisive weapons, the U.S. standardized victory. A metal-hulled truck had become more lethal than a panzer, not by destroying, but by allowing the war to go on unabated. But the American doctrine would not stop there, because the DUKWs didn't just cross rivers. They reset the order of attack. The next turning point would come in the way these vehicles would be used as a leading force, rather than as support. What would come next was not transportation, it was the first wave, and she carried everything. For 3 years, DUKWs were seen by the Germans as secondary vehicles, an appendage of the infantry, a luxury ally for coastal operations. Intelligence reports classified them with terms such as improvised boats on wheels, unarmored support vehicles, and, in certain documents, logistical rear transport. No report even suggested that these machines could be used as a spearhead in a large-scale river offensive. The fault wasn't in not seeing the DUKW. It was in not seeing what it represented. Because, while the Germans watched him with technical disdain, the Americans were rehearsing a completely new doctrine, the use of logistics as a vanguard. They crossed the Maas River with DUKWs, tested fast shipments in Sicily, fitted formations in Anzio, experimented with night landings in Salerno. Every movement was a living experiment, but the enemy only saw peripheral exercises. The American doctrine has become invisible precisely because it seems too obvious. And this is where the sharpest irony of this story arises. The Germans saw the tool but never understood the method. They watched the tests, the landings, the maneuvers, but they assumed that it was improvised. They did not understand that they were facing a new form of war, shaped not by theoreticians but by engineers and workers. The invisibility of the DUKW as a threat was not an accident. It was part of a larger phenomenon, the refusal of the German military elite to believe that the war could be won with simplicity. For a doctrine based on decisive weapons such as V-2 rockets or Tiger tanks, the idea that a propeller truck posed a threat was laughable to say the least. The high command bet on high-impact technical solutions. The American doctrine, on the contrary, invested in scale, standardization, and redundancy. Where the Germans saw more of the same, the Americans saw strategic repetition, and while Berlin produced tanks in small series with constant variations, Detroit produced DUKWs like those who produce pens, inline, with interchangeable parts and simplified training. The enemy was waiting for a monster. He received a swarm. Post-war interviews with Abwehr officers revealed the degree of this blindness. One analyst described the DUKWs as coastal transport instruments with no relevant tactical value. Another stated that no modern army would base its offensive on such limited vehicles. The problem was precisely this. The Americans did not see the DUKW as the center of their offensive. They saw the entire offensive as an extension of logistics, and the DUKW was just another cog. He was not a mechanical hero. It was part of a system that worked in depth. While the Germans prepared to resist an organized advance in phases, the Allies planned for a continuous infiltration, capable of feeding on the move. And for this reason, they were never detected by the traditional parameters of military analysis. German intelligence, so efficient in anticipating armored movements and artillery positioning, failed to understand the very concept that would defeat them: integrated logistical warfare. Because there is no breaking point when there is no fixed point. DUKWs crossed rivers in unlikely locations, moved like civilian convoys, carried everything they needed, and communicated in real time with air and ground units. They were operated by ordinary soldiers with minimal training. None of these characteristics fit the classic threat models, but all of them made the vehicle essential. And there was another factor that prevented the detection of the American doctrine: the absence of protagonism. The DUKWs were not in the headlines. They were not celebrated in parades. They did not appear in propaganda films. Unlike Panzers or Messerschmitts, DUKWs acted in operational silence. They appeared, delivered, disappeared. For an enemy accustomed to associating power with appearance, it was easy to overlook a clumsy truck that didn't fire shots. But it was exactly this silence that made him so lethal. Because it didn't demand attention, it required a reaction. And when the reaction came, it was too late. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. The DUKW crossed rivers, bays, canals, harbors, and inlets, always in sight. And even then, it was classified as irrelevant. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts ignored by traditional history, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more detailed content like this, based on technical data and original documents. American doctrine was not secret. It was just too simple to be taken seriously. And this is what makes the German failure so emblematic. Because it was not defeated by a new weapon, nor by superior technology. It was won by a method. And the method doesn't have to be sophisticated, just work. In the end, it wasn't speed, armor, or range that made the difference. It was the ability to repeat, to sustain, to continue. And when the DUKWs began to cross the Rhine, they were not alone. Because from the sky also came something unexpected, an elite force with an even more audacious plan. And that would forever change the definition of front line. When the time came to cross the Rhine, the Allied generals did not hesitate. They knew what the Germans expected. Weeks of preparation, bridgeheads under fire, painstaking engineering, and finally, makeshift structures connecting the banks of Germany's largest river. That was how an obstacle like the Rhine was crossed, according to all the manuals. But that was not how the Americans planned to act. The Allied command, under the direction of Omar Bradley in the center and Bernard Montgomery in the north, decided to completely reverse the logic of the Continental War. The DUKWs, until then considered support vehicles, would be promoted to the front line. They wouldn't wait for the bridges. They would cross first, and they would not cross voids. The first wave would carry not only soldiers but also ammunition, radios, light artillery, field medics, fuel, and hot food. Each DUKW would be a floating microbase, capable of sustaining continuous combat as soon as it touched the eastern bank. American logistics had ceased to be a rearguard. It was now the tip of the spear. This decision was more than bold. It was a doctrinal rupture. The choice to put logistics vehicles at the forefront ran counter to decades of military thinking. But the data was on their side. Tests at Anzio and Normandy had already shown that the DUKW could withstand moderate fire, sail in low visibility, and maintain a steady supply even under pressure. Now it was time to apply that knowledge on a full scale. Instead of waiting for engineering to make its way, logistics would take over. When the first DUKWs began gliding through the waters of the Rhine at 9 p.m. on March 23, 1945, they carried more than cargo. They carried the new doctrine of modern warfare. The Germans were still waiting for the initial explosions. Their batteries were calibrated to hit bridges under construction, their snipers positioned to eliminate engineers and sappers. But no one showed up. No bridges were built. Instead, what emerged were elongated silhouettes approaching each other in a line. The first shots came too late. DUKWs didn't rely on surprise. They relied on persistence, and there were hundreds of them. Those who were hit spun in the water and gave way to others. The margins did not resist. In less than an hour, more than 1,000 American troops were on the other side, already with supplies, communications, and functional air coordination. The magnitude of this decision can only be understood by observing its execution. Each DUKW had an exact itinerary, a specific load, and a pre-programmed destination. There was no improvisation. The crossing was treated as an industrial operation, continuous cycles of entry, disembarkation, and return. And most importantly, without a break. Every minute without activity was considered a failure of planning. Convoys operated in relays, while smaller motorized ferries carried additional reinforcements. In parallel, Air Force gliders landed behind German lines, further expanding the penetration zone. The crossing, therefore, was not just an advance. It was the foundation of a new operational axis. The German command only realized the gravity of the situation when reports began to come in with tactical inconsistencies. One battalion reported being attacked by vehicles that emerged from the river. Another mentioned entire units disembarking with supplies ready and medical support already in place. The shock was not only physical, but mental. The enemy had not infiltrated. It had been transported en masse. The line of defense, based on phase interruption, became useless. Because there were no phases, the war was being waged simultaneously. This is the point where logistics becomes offensive. Montgomery, known for his methodical precision, described the operation as an amphibious clock. Bradley, for his part, pointed out that the DUKWs did not cross the Rhine. They opened the Rhine. This language was not metaphorical. It was technical. The crossing was not the consequence of an earlier success. It was the beginning of the final campaign. And its logic was replicated at all levels. The columns of DUKWs didn't just carry. They reconnected the front with the rear in real time. Newly landed troops already had functional radio, continuous power, spare parts, medical evacuation, and, in specific cases, direct coordination with air artillery. It was the equivalent of landing an entire operating base on the move. Unlike the German doctrine, which provided for stabilization before advance, the Americans had learned to advance already stabilized. The difference was brutal. While the defenders were still putting up resistance on the maps, logistical columns were already enveloping them on the flanks. The offensive was no longer linear. It became a mobile organism, nourished by the constant flow of resources and protected by the capacity to replenish. The power was not in the armor. It was in continuity. And the DUKW was its most perfect expression. But there was still a detail that escaped enemy analysis. Many of these DUKWs did not just carry ammunition or troops. Some carried much more specific and unexpected loads, charges that would not only cross the Rhine, but that would alter the behavior of the entire battlefield. Because the Americans weren't just coming in with supplies. They were coming in with advanced communications, with antennas, with decoders, and with something even more devastating: German-speaking operators. For years, Wehrmacht gunners had trained to recognize a specific sound, the return of barges after the first wave had landed. That sound was the trigger, the precise indication that the second wave of soldiers would be in preparation, vulnerable, compressed on the opposite bank, waiting to cross. It was at this moment that the artillery concentrated fire. The guns were positioned with this rhythm in mind. The sound of water shovels crashing against the hull, the echo of barges moving away, the muffled screams of operators. It was all part of a pattern. But that night on the banks of the Rhine, nothing went as expected. When the forward observers reported movement in the waters, the gunners waited for the cycle: arrival, landing, return. But the sound that emerged from the darkness did not obey this ritual. They were not light wooden engines beating against the flow of the river. It was a deep, continuous roar muffled by fog and diesel. A metallic sound, constant, and most importantly, no brakes. The DUKWs did not return. They did not back down. They crossed and moved on. It was as if water had ceased to be an obstacle and had become just another road. This break in the pattern was more than tactical. It was sensory. The scorers hesitated. They were waiting for the return. But the return never came. The continuous sound of the engines confused the distance estimation. The columns of DUKWs approached each other at overlapping intervals, creating an auditory flow that masked the actual number of vehicles. The German command, still tied to the logic of the barges, could not understand why the cycle of crossing was not repeated. The response time, which depended on predictability, was disjointed. When the first shots came, it was too late. The Americans were no longer in the water. They were on land, reorganizing lines, establishing communications, setting up defensive positions, and guiding the next convoys. And there was an additional detail: the visual silence. The DUKWs, operating in dense fog and with minimal lighting, did not generate clear silhouettes for artillery observers. Without flames, without explosions, without the metallic shine characteristic of barges, they became inaccurate targets. And unlike larger floating structures, they did not offer a fixed point. A DUKW was too small to justify heavy artillery fire, and too fast to be accurately targeted by mortars. The result was a useless dispersal of ammunition, while amphibious convoys landed hundreds of meters from the planned points, opening infiltration corridors in places completely ignored by German defensive doctrine. The collapse of the response system was not just a human error. It was a defeat of doctrine. The Wehrmacht's artillery, trained to react in stages, now faced an enemy that did not operate in phases. The American crossing of the Rhine was continuous, indifferent to the traditional cadence of river warfare. What was once first wave and second wave was now just flow. The DUKWs brought troops, ammunition, hot food, engineers, radio antennas, medical units, and up-to-date maps, all in the same vehicle, in the same movement. And they kept coming. The bank was no longer a staging zone. It was a crossing point. The war had lost its pause. And with it, Germany lost the time to react. This inversion also had mental consequences. The reports of the German line troops describe a scenario of increasing disorientation. A sergeant of the 256th Volksgrenadier recorded in his diary, "We were waiting for the sound of the oars. We get the roar of a factory." The comparison is not exaggerated. The continuous sound of the DUKWs, interspersed with mechanical noises of landing, generated the feeling that something much bigger was happening, that the crossing was not local, it was industrial, that the Rhine, once a symbol of barrier, now functioned as a production conveyor. And in tactical terms, it was exactly that. The operation had no beginning, middle, and end. It was a cyclical process, underpinned by logistical precision and mechanical redundancy. The German artillery, even well-positioned, began to shoot by reflex. With no clear targets, no schedule, no fixed points, firing became trial and error. And with each mistake, more DUKWs crossed. The Americans knew this. They knew that logistical superiority did not have to destroy the enemy. It was enough to nullify it. And in this case, it was enough to keep the flow. The strategy was simple. Saturate German reaction time until it became irrelevant. And that's what they did. In less than 6 hours, more than 4,000 soldiers had crossed all the support elements necessary to maintain forward positions and prepare the advance of armored vehicles. The war was on the move. And German maps, for the first time, no longer made sense. But there was something even more unsettling for the defenders. The units that were arriving did not behave like reconnaissance forces. They did not expect orders. They did not seek contact. They already arrived with defined missions. They came down from the DUKWs with maps in hand, with active communication, with pre-plotted tactical objectives. It was as if the crossing had taken place days before, as if they were already in familiar territory. And in a way, they were, because the American operators came armed with detailed information, with radio intercepts, with translations of enemy orders, and more than anything, with familiarity with the terrain. Many of the soldiers there had crossed the Rhine several times, in training, in simulations, in previous operations. To them, that river was not an enigma. It was a route, and the final destination was getting closer and closer, because behind the DUKWs, something even greater would come, and much heavier. German defensive doctrine was clear. Any attempt to cross the Rhine would require a limited number of crossing points. The manual stipulated between 6 and 8 possible crossings based on depth, current, and artillery cover capacity. These points were thoroughly studied, fortified, and monitored. It was here that the anti-tank divisions, 80mm batteries, and sapper platoons were positioned, ready to turn any attempted breakthrough into a massacre. But the DUKWs did not respect the geometry of the war. They did not follow the predictable paths. They created their own. In less than 24 hours, more than 40 crossing points had been opened simultaneously, many of them where the Germans swore it was impossible to cross. An officer from the 11th Panzer Corps wrote, "We couldn't even pinpoint where the front line ends. Americans just come up on the banks as if the river didn't exist." The defense built around fixed axes collapsed in the face of an enemy attacking from all sides, at the same time. This pulverization of the axes of attack created an unprecedented crisis of command. The reports sent to the Wehrmacht headquarters in the Rhineland were contradictory, fragmentary, and alarming. One detachment reported enemy presence east of the Rhine without any bridges being reported. Another mentioned tanks emerging from forests that were beyond the waterline. The chaos was not the result of brute force. It was the result of superior logistical logic. The DUKWs were landing troops with such speed and in so many locations at once that German maps became obsolete in a matter of hours. Points of resistance that had been meticulously prepared to counter frontal assaults were simply ignored. The war no longer came head-on. It ran down the sides. And the collapse wasn't just physical, it was mathematical. For every crossing point the Germans could cover, the Americans opened 5 more. There was not enough artillery. There was no reserve infantry. There was no time. Every hour, more American units landed with full supplies and specific orders. Doctors were already treating the injured. Radios were already picking up interceptions. Cartographers were updating routes in real time. It was like facing an army that had rehearsed that operation for years. And in fact, there was. While the Germans were betting on the rigidity of the defensive line, the Americans had created a system capable of adapting, infiltrating, and surviving. The line simply evaporated, and what was left was a fluid terrain, where only one side understood the rules. This tactical collapse can be illustrated by a statistic that the Germans completely ignored. American production of amphibious vehicles between 1942 and 1945 was more than 10 times greater than the sum of all Axis motorized river transport units in the same period. 10 times. In volume, in scale, and above all in readiness for combined operations. A DUKW could be built in a few hours, tested in half a day, and transported to the front in the same supply convoy. It was a product of industry in its purest form. If this difference surprised you, leave your comment with absolute power or logistics wins, because that's exactly what the Reich didn't understand, the power that doesn't come from a weapon, but from a production chain. And when American tanks began to appear behind German lines, transported by ferries, and even by adapted DUKWs, the Wehrmacht panicked. No bridges under construction had been reported. No attempt at a fixed structure had been identified, but the armored vehicles were already on the flank. There were already Shermans advancing along country roads east of the Rhine, even before the Germans had discovered where the initial landing had taken place. The line of command broke. Contradictory orders circulated. Some units tried to retreat, only to find that the Americans were already between them and the rear. On a 200-kilometer stretch of front, the Rhine had ceased to be a barrier, and had become an inverted mirror, where everything the Germans expected. It happened the other way around. Maps captured by U.S. troops in late March reveal the doctrinal tragedy. Entire sectors still marked the possible crossing points with red circles, while the Americans advanced through places marked as impassable. The German cartographic language itself could no longer represent the actual battlefield, and the disorientation was not only of the command. Entire Volksgrenadier troops were captured without a fight, cornered by forces that had crossed the Rhine without making a sound, without bridging, without announcing an offensive. The war was being fought with tools invisible to traditional doctrine, and by then the question was no longer how the Americans were crossing, but when they would stop. Because behind each DUKW came another, and behind each column, a factory was coming. When the first German prisoners were interrogated after crossing the Rhine, a curious pattern emerged in the accounts. Many, still stunned by the speed of the offensive, did not ask about tanks, planes, or Allied divisions. They wanted to know something else. How did the U.S. Navy get here? The question, in essence, was not rhetorical. It was the result of a deep symbolic shock. In the imagination of the German soldier, the U.S. Navy was an ocean-going force destined to fight in the Pacific, protect convoys in the Atlantic, or drop Marines on distant shores. But there, in the heart of West Germany, in rural fields, among orchards and villages, what you saw was the U.S. Navy flag flying in strange vehicles, with operators in blue uniforms coordinating logistical operations in the middle of the battlefield. It was as if the sea had invaded the continent. And the explanation was simpler and more devastating than they imagined. The Navy had floated there aboard DUKWs. This naval presence in a land theater created a mental disorientation that weapons could not provoke. The Germans were prepared for tanks, for artillery, for aerial bombardments, but they were not prepared to see Navy men operating vehicles on dirt roads, fueling columns, installing radios, driving with logistical maps in hand, and coordinating cargo in real time. War, which for 5 years had been shaped by fixed lines and defined fronts, now became three-dimensional. American logistics dissolved borders. What was once the exclusive domain of the Army became an interforce operation. The traditional doctrine, terrestrial, sequential, and compartmentalized, simply could no longer support that reality. German reports recorded this surprise in almost comical terms. A captain in the 9th Panzer Division reported being captured by Marines after his outpost was overrun by armed DUKWs. Another prisoner described the scene of a column of amphibious vehicles advancing in fog, with uniformed operators broadcasting orders by radio as they unloaded boxes marked with the Navy seal. For the Germans, the conclusion was only one. The Americans had created a new type of task force with no equivalent in the European theater. And in fact, they did. The operation to cross the Rhine was coordinated by elements of the Army, Navy, and Air Force in absolute synchrony, and DUKWs, due to their versatility and mobility, have become the perfect logistical link between the three. The historical irony could not be more brutal. Germany, the birthplace of Clausewitz, the doctrine of blitzkrieg and panzer divisions, was now traversed by sailors in 6-wheeled vehicles, designed to save castaways and delivering howitzers to wheat fields. The enemy, who relied so much on lines and borders, was now surrounded by an adversary who ignored them all. U.S. naval units, trained to operate under the rules of the sea, adapted to the river and land environment with surgical precision, and with that, they became invisible to the eyes that still saw the war with trench logic. But the impact was not only psychological. The integration of forces allowed for a logistics chain never seen before on the continent. A convoy of DUKWs could be carried by sailors, escorted by infantry and guided by aerial signaling, all in real time, all on the move. This convergence of capabilities created a support network that no German unit could break. Where there was once flank, there was now continuity. Where there was once a pause, now there was a cycle. And where there was resistance before, now there was disorientation. The Navy's presence also brought another unexpected element: communication codes. By operating with protocols different from those used by the Army, the American sailors further confused enemy interception. The orders transmitted by the DUKW's radios did not match the usual pattern of ground units, which led the Abwehr to conclude that new battalions were being introduced, when in fact it was just the same logistical system operating with multiple protocols. War became a beehive, with each cell functioning independently, but interconnected by a constant stream of data, fuel, and ammunition. One of the most symbolic moments took place in the city of Oppenheim. As German units prepared to counterattack a suspected poorly defended beachhead, they were surprised by a force that was already entrenched, communicating with reconnaissance planes and receiving direct supplies via DUKWs, coordinated by Navy officers. The German response collapsed within minutes. What was supposed to be a counterattack became more of a mass capture. The boundary between the military branches was gone, and with it, any notion of where the battlefield began or ended. The presence of the U.S. Navy on German soil was therefore more than an operational surprise. It was a symbol of the complete collapse of the conceptual framework of the German war. They expected a terrestrial enemy. They received an amphibious force within their own country. They expected bridges. They received floating columns. They expected armies separated by doctrines. They received full integration. And when they finally tried to organize a coordinated response, they found that it was too late. Because the DUKWs didn't come alone. They carried something that would definitely change the speed of the war. The armored vehicles began to cross, and with them came the sound the Germans feared most, the roar of hundreds of tanks on the other side of the Rhine. Throughout the war, classical doctrine had taught that in order to invade enemy territory through a natural obstacle such as the Rhine, one would first have to establish a bridgehead, a safe fortified zone on the opposite bank, where the first units would land. This bridgehead would then be gradually expanded, defended with artillery, and only then would the transport of supplies, heavy equipment, and reinforcements come. It was a slow, predictable, linear progression. But DUKWs were not created to follow this logic. They did not ask permission to the land. They didn't ask for time. Each of them operated as an autonomous invasion capsule, capable of delivering ammunition, communication, and combat power several kilometers into enemy territory, without needing a prior base, without waiting for structural security. The first wave that crossed the Rhine arrived ready to sustain prolonged combat, and not in a visible line but in multiple disconnected points, along a front of more than 100 kilometers. What was once a centralized advance has become an organic infiltration. The Germans were looking for a bridgehead, and found nothing, because there was no head. There was a whole body, Already in motion, this paradigm shift hit the Wehrmacht's command systems hard. The regional control centers sought to locate the main axis of invasion to concentrate forces and articulate counterattacks. But there was no axis. There were pulses. In small villages, on forest trails, and open fields, DUKWs would emerge carrying radio, ammunition, medical supplies, maps, engineering tools, and platoons of full infantry. They did not come in droves, but in sufficient numbers to open space, organize defense, and guide the next convoys. By the time German artillery began to adjust its shots to a crossing point, it was too late. The operation had migrated to another sector, and this happened not once or twice, but dozens. The crossing of the Rhine is no longer an isolated moment. It became a steady stream of small simultaneous invasions. The direct consequence was the collapse of cartographic logic. German tactical maps, which relied on an orderly structure of advance and lines of resistance, became useless. The sectors marked as at risk by intelligence were already taken. The points defined as unlikely were precisely the most active. Entire units tried to move to counter what they believed to be a major advance, only to find that they had been surrounded by multiple corps that had never crossed any bridges. The concept of the front has evaporated. A general of the 7th Army described, "We have not been able to locate where the attack starts. Each point seems to be the center." And he was right, because the Americans weren't attacking from one place. They were invading everyone. This decentralization of the offensive was only possible because each DUKW was an independent cell. Unlike landing barges, which relied on fixed infrastructure, the DUKs operated on any bank, under any condition. Its navigation system allowed real-time adjustments, and its 6x6 traction ensured that when it touched the ground, it immediately transformed into a truck. It wasn't just transportation, it was continuity. The operation did not need a break for transition, and with that, the old logic of first establish then advance was discarded. The Americans were advancing as they settled. They were on the move before they were even seen, and this not only confused the enemy, it nullified his doctrine. The rupture was so absolute that even the command orders began to lose value. A German regiment was instructed to position itself north of a certain village, and found the place already occupied by American troops, with light artillery installed, a working radio, and an active supply route. The rear units, as they tried to regroup, found that they were surrounded by forces that were not part of any main offensive. They were small detachments, operating with surgical efficiency, opening space and destabilizing any attempt at cohesive resistance. What should have been a territorial advance has become a disintegration operation. German war analysts, in trying to understand what had happened, discovered a disconcerting statistic. In the first 48 hours of the crossing alone, more than 400 logistical missions were completed by DUKWs without the use of bridge, road, or railway line. This included the transport of 15,000 troops, 2,800 tons of ammunition, and hundreds of engineering equipment, all delivered directly to the combat zone. This scale, repeated in uninterrupted cycles, could not be met by a doctrine that still believed in preparation time. If this statistic surprised you, comment, "Unbelievable," or "Logistics wins," because in fact, it was logistics, not tanks, that crushed the Rhine. The direct reflection of this operation was the collapse of the very notion of containment. By the time the German divisions finally identified a critical sector and mobilized force to counterattack, they were already being outflanked by units that had crossed the river by 10 other different routes. The war had become asymmetrical within the territory itself, and the panic spread with the same speed as the DUKWs, because while Germany was trying to locate the bridgehead, the invasion was already operating in the backbone, and from then on, no rear guard was safe. Because the Americans still had one final trump card to displace, something that didn't float but crushed. The heavy armor was about to cross, and the Rhine was now no longer a waterline. It was an avenue of steel. In the classic doctrine of the Wehrmacht, the armored reserves were the decisive hammer. Guarded behind the front line, they awaited the critical moment to identify the breaking point, gather strength, and crush the enemy with concentrated power. It was a logic that worked when the battlefield had a center, but on the Rhine, in March 1945, this center no longer existed. The reports of the panzer divisions showed the absurdity. State-of-the-art tanks, such as the Panther and Jagdpanzer IVs, were positioned on standby, engines running, ammunition supplied, crews alert, and no destination, no order, no coordinates precise. What reached the command centers were fragmentary reports. Infiltration south of Boppard, movement in Oppenheim, contact in Remagen, vehicles identified among forests north of mines. But there was no confirmation of where the main attack was, and worse, there was not even confirmation of which flank it was, because the flanks had ceased to exist. The speed with which the DUKWs created advance pockets made it impossible to establish a line of containment. When one sector was reinforced with troops, another collapsed. When a platoon was sent to reconnoiter a bank, it found that the enemy was already in its rear. The generals, trained to think in terms of axis, front, and depth, were forced to face a war of moving points. It was no longer a linear confrontation. It was a diffuse infiltration, where each American cell could act, resist, transmit, and sustain combat on its own. It was like fighting a swarm. Wherever it attacked, other nuclei were already active. The German reserves, prepared to crush a centralized advance, were trapped in hesitation. Launching a counterattack required knowing where to focus. But with dozens of micro-invasions underway, any movement of panzer divisions became vulnerable to ambushes, enemy aviation, and logistical breakdowns. There was no longer an enemy in line. There was an enemy everywhere, and he didn't need a base. He didn't need a bridge. The DUKWs advanced, opened position, and fed the front with a continuous logistical flow. A clearing, a stretch of road, or a flat field was enough to establish a new route. The reserves could not keep up with this logic, and they stood still. The diaries of German officers reveal the bewilderment. A commander of the 11th Panzer Division noted, "We received 12 separate reports of crossings. Neither confirms the other. The front line is dissolved. We ask for authorization to act. Answer, wait." In another excerpt, "Our forces are intact, but there is nowhere to send them." This waiting, which in previous conflicts represented prudence, was now paralysis. Because the Americans didn't expect it. Every minute of hesitation was a new breakthrough, a new isolated sector, a new detachment of DUKWs delivering ammunition and medics, where before there was only an empty flank. The concept of defending the riverbank has become obsolete. The Rhine, instead of being the containment line, became an artery, and the DUKWs, their logistic globules, nurtured the invasion in real time. There was nowhere else to concentrate fire. The panzers, designed to crush masses, were trying to hunt shadows. At Oppenheim, an armored reserve force was mobilized to intercept what was believed to be the main bridgehead. When he arrived at the scene, he found tire trails, empty supplies, and an abandoned radio still transmitting. The DUKWs were already 8 kilometers away, opening up another corridor. And meanwhile, American infantry forces received non-stop reinforcements. Each DUK brought more than soldiers. It brought continuity. In many areas, Americans did not even stop to set up camps. They operated in rotation, alternating positions, creating new support points in record time. The German troops, who had been hoping for a major logistical buildup before the heavy advance, did not realize that the Americans had merged build and advance into one, and that the reserves, parked waiting for an opportunity, were being cut off by an invisible infiltration network. A network that didn't need to be defended, it just needed to be maintained. The German paralysis reached its peak when the command at Koblenz received a tactical map of the crossing sectors. The document listed 43 active invasion points. Only 7 matched military intelligence estimates. The rest, totally unexpected, in places considered impassable, on steep banks, in stretches without visibility. It was as if the Americans had decided on purpose to cross where it was forbidden, and they succeeded, because they were not bound by the doctrine of waiting, because they have turned transport into a strategy, because they created the unthinkable, absolute mobility. And it is at this moment that the most humiliating statistic appears. During the first 3 days of the crossing, more than 2,000 DUKWs operated at 93% efficiency. This means that almost all vehicles arrived at their destination without damage, delivered the cargo, returned to operation, in continuous cycles. This rate is not just a number, it is the death knell of the enemy doctrine. Because while German tanks waited for orders, American trucks floated, moved forward, and decided the war. And if that already seemed devastating, what would come later would no longer have wheels. It would have treadmills. And weight. Too much weight. As American forces crossed the Rhine in metallic silence under the heavy March fog, something even more devastating than guns and ammunition crossed with them. Normalcy. The DUKWs didn't just carry soldiers ready to fight. They carried hot coffee, medical supplies, refined fuel, radios with backup batteries, and mobile kitchens. At many points, the first wave of troops was already disembarking with guaranteed hot food for the next 24 hours. And that was no coincidence. It was politics. It was doctrine. It was war made like an assembly line, where each piece arrived at the right time, in the right place, at the right temperature. For the hungry, exhausted Germans struggling with leaky shoes and rations reduced to crumbs of dry bread, the impact was not only physical, it was moral. One POW interrogated in Mainz reported, with astonishment and anger, that he saw American soldiers lining up to get apple pie while grenades were still exploding nearby. On another front, near Worms, German civilians witnessed amphibious trucks unloading drums of drinking water and boxes of individual medical kits, while local hospitals no longer had even morphine. The image was brutal, an army that seemed to be coming home, and another, defending ruins. Because DUKWs didn't just carry resources, they carried stability. And in the chaos of a collapsing Germany, this was more menacing than any armored vehicle. American logistics had surpassed the concept of supply. It had become an environment. The soldiers ate well, slept better, had constant access to medical care and communications. The ranks were clean, disciplined, and mechanized. A DUKW could carry everything from mortars to inflatable hospital tents. And they did so, not only for military efficiency, but because they understood that war was also won by the mental state of the combatant. A platoon that sleeps dry and eats hot resists more. A soldier who knows he will be rescued if wounded fights better. And this system of support, invisible to the eyes of German doctrine, was precisely what undermined the moral resistance of the defenders. The Germans watched with bewilderment. They hoped to face an enemy suffering from the crossing, exhausted by the difficulty of transporting supplies by barges and makeshift bridges. Instead, they were given fresh, well-fed units, operating in sync with artillery and aviation, and with logistical support literally floating behind them. The result was a profound emotional disparity. In each sector where the DUKWs arrived before the tanks, the Americans found time to set up radio stations, field kitchens, and medical centers. In some zones, prisoners captured within the first 24 hours were already receiving full medical treatment, while their own rear hospitals were collapsing. The war of images began to be reversed. The surprise wasn't just in the efficiency, it was in the abundance. Wehrmacht reports indicated that shortages were already the rule on the defense fronts. Less than 400 calories per day per soldier in some sectors, boots patched with wire, rationed ammunition to the point of prohibiting covering fire. Meanwhile, the Americans delivered about 6,000 calories a day to each advancing combatant. Yes, 6,000, and that included desserts, combat rations with chocolate, juice, coffee, biscuits, and canned meat. In part, because it was necessary to maintain the fighting force. Partly because they could, because his industrial machine produced with surplus. If this number impresses you, comment, shocking data, or absolute power. Because this was not just a tactical victory, it was a systemic humiliation. In an intercepted letter from a German officer dated March 24th, there is the outburst. I don't understand how they do it. They arrive with everything. They attack and already have a tent set up, a stove lit, a radio on. It looks like they're not at war. It looks like they're in training. And indeed, that was the impression. For those who defended hand-dug trenches, without supplies and under constant bombardment, facing an army that crossed rivers on wheels and hot food was like facing the future and discovering that it had already won. The psychological impact of this logistics was as profound as the physical. Because the DUKWs didn't just arrive before the Germans, they arrived with the comfort that the Germans had lost. They carried not only ammunition, but a cruel reminder of what the Reich had promised and did not deliver: organization, well-being, order. While Nazi propaganda wallowed in empty promises, American propaganda floated, armored in steel and stuffed with hot food. It was a war won in the belly, in sleep, in discipline. A war where who rested better? He shot better. The contrast was even more visible in the areas of immediate occupation. In several villages, the first American forces that arrived with the Ducks were followed by platoons of medical engineering and civilian care units. Within 72 hours, many German civilians were receiving more assistance from the invaders than they had received from their own government in recent months. The line between occupation and humanitarian relief was beginning to blur, and the American soldier, by delivering clean water and hot food, gained something even more powerful than territorial control. He gained legitimacy. All of this came from a ridiculed vehicle. The DUKW, born out of a logistical emergency and underrated as a wheeled boat, proved to be more than an invention. It proved to be a walking doctrine. Each example was a support cell, an extension of the rear guard, a machine for normalizing the impossible. And if the advance already seemed relentless, what would come next would require a new scale of comparison, because the next one to cross the Rhine would not come loaded only with comfort and ammunition. It would come loaded with armor, rotating turrets, and a silhouette that the Germans knew well, but never imagined seeing floating. As the DUKWs glided over the waters of the Rhine like silent amphibious serpents, the German sky began to darken for an even more unexpected reason: the shadow of the largest airborne operation on German soil. In the early hours of March 24, 1945, Operation Varsity was activated, and with it the last piece of Allied tactical machinery was set in motion. More than 1,100 transport planes and converted bombers, accompanied by 1,300 gliders, began to streak the skies of Western Germany. Each carried the weight of the new paradigm of warfare: full troops, equipment, radios, anti-tank armaments, scouts, veteran paratroopers from the 17th Airborne Corps and the British 6th Division. The coordination was not symbolic, it was surgical. While the DUKWs created horizontal seeps through the water, the gliders and paratroopers pierced the air and fell directly on the flanks and rear of the German units. For the first time in history, a large-scale river crossing was accompanied by a synchronized air offensive in real time. The result was total denial of depth. There was nowhere to retreat. There was nowhere to prepare resistance. The drop points did not follow traditional logic. Many gliders were purposely launched behind the supposedly safe lines, forcing the Germans to split their already hesitant reserves. The tactic was not just to advance, it was to saturate, create multiple simultaneous contact zones. A Wehrmacht major described the scene. First we heard the engines in the waters, then the engines in the skies, and then both. We didn't know where to shoot, nor why. Desperation grew as the paratroopers, armed with bazookas and portable radios, began to open new control zones dozens of kilometers from the official crossing points. And even more alarming, they have started to be replenished by the DUKWs themselves. Yes, vehicles that had crossed the Rhine were now being used to supply isolated airborne units in the German countryside. DUKWs no longer served only as carriers from margin to margin. They became logistical liaison vehicles between forces that had entered through totally different routes. What was once an obstacle, the river, had become a link, and what was once a division between sky and ground was now just another layer of maneuver. It was war in 3 dimensions. Logistics didn't just keep up with the advance, it drove it. In a matter of hours, detachments that had landed with minimal supplies were receiving ammunition, food, and renewed orders coming by radio from the DUKWs in the rear. It was a synchrony that German doctrine simply did not recognize as possible. In his view, air operations needed days for stabilization, supplies by launch, and construction of beachheads. But what was seen there was another level. It was a tactical fusion, where the logistical response time was equal to or greater than the combat speed. And with that, the pace of the offensive became unbreakable. Operation Varsity also revealed another brutal aspect: psychological saturation. German officials report that in certain sectors the noise of transport aircraft was constant. The skies were not cleared. Every hour, new waves of gliders, paratroopers, or support bombers appeared over the cities and countryside. The feeling of siege came not only from the ground advance, but from the air stay, as if the atmosphere itself had been occupied. And once again, the origin of this domain was industrial. While the Luftwaffe could barely get squadrons flying, the Americans mobilized full fleets of Dakotas, Wacos, and Horsa, converted civilian planes, mass-produced gliders, and massively trained pilots operating with millimeter precision. During the first 3 days of the offensive, About 16,000 paratroopers and more than 2,400 tons of equipment were dropped directly by air. This was in addition to the thousands of tons arriving by DUKWs, jeeps, trucks, and barges. Never in history had an army sustained an offensive in so many directions and with so many logistical means simultaneously. The Rhine, which for centuries had been a barrier of contention, was now an integral part of the circulatory system of a continually expanding military force. And any attempt to disrupt that flow, she was simply run over. The most symbolic, however, was the testimony gathered after the surrender of a defense unit near Wesel. A captured German colonel said, "During the bombing, we were waiting for the crossing. When it started, we were waiting for a point of attack. When the ducks showed up, we were expecting a break. When the gliders descended, we expected reinforcements. But when we saw that the paratroopers were being resupplied by water, we knew that there was no more logic. I just moved forward." And he was right, because in fact the logic had changed. The crossing of the Rhine was not just the overcoming of a physical obstacle. It was the ultimate demonstration that modern warfare would be won, not by those with the strongest line, but by those with the most integrated system. While German generals calculated endurance in terms of terrain and time, Americans operated with fluidity, synchrony, and redundancy. And this doctrine, which seemed impossible, still kept its final act. Because if until now what has crossed the Rhine have been light troops, supplies, and airborne, the next move would involve what the Germans feared most: tons of steel rolling toward the heart of the Reich, not by bridges, not by roads, but by the current itself. For years, the Wehrmacht's doctrine was revered as the most accurate, disciplined, and efficient in Europe. It was a war machine built on manuals, maps, and coded maneuvers. Every step of the defense was anchored in tactical traditions that came from Moltke, brutally adapted by Guderian and his contemporaries. But in front of the Rhine, all this turned to dust, because the enemy that emerged from the mist did not follow the chapters of doctrine. He ignored them completely. There was no advance in line, beachhead, armored vehicles waiting for reinforcement. There was just a continuous flow of power, of steel, of supply, of coordination, and all of it coming from multiple directions, through multiple routes, with multiple functions, at the same time. It was no longer a war of maneuver. It was a war of intelligent saturation. The German generals captured after the crossing confessed, "We were trained to hold bridges, not to stop the river." The German logic, built on the predictability that each crossing would require days of preparation, was dismantled in hours. The Rhine, instead of a barrier, became a catalyst. And this reversal didn't come from guns. It came from minds. American intelligence understood that it did not need to confront German doctrine head-on. It was enough to go around it, or ignore it. And so he did. Instead of reinforcing the obvious points, the Allies created dozens of micro-points. Instead of protecting the rear convoys, they took the rear with them. Instead of waiting for tactical guarantees, they relied on logistical redundancy. And that is what Germany did not know how to read. They expected tactical genius at Rommel's level, but they weren't prepared for the industry's operational genius. The interrogations of senior Wehrmacht officers recorded in British and American camps in the following weeks reveal the conceptual shock. A division general stated, "We had doctrine, they had production. We thought that gave us an advantage. We were wrong." Another added, "When the first DUKW crossed the Rhine, we didn't understand. When the 100th passed, we still thought it was improvised. When the 1000th arrived, we knew that the war was over." It was more than the loss of territory. It was the surrender of a mental model. German doctrine, with all its tradition, glory, and discipline, collapsed because it was not made to deal with an enemy who sought neither glory nor tradition, just efficiency. The contrast between the two systems was visible even in the details. While the Germans still relied on messenger communication, the Americans used radio networks on multiple frequencies, with redundancy between air, ground, and amphibious units. While German supplies followed destroyed trails, DUKWs traced new routes over the water. While each German move had to be authorized by successive levels of command, the American tactical groups operated with full autonomy, guided by clear logistical objectives. It was decentralization against hierarchy, elasticity versus stiffness, adaptation against tradition. And in this field, tradition did not stand a chance. The final irony was that the Wehrmacht's own virtue, its precise predictability, became its greatest weakness. Because in a scenario where everything changes every hour, where the front ceases to exist, where supplies arrive before the troops, and where the sky and water are avenues of attack, precision dies. And he dies suffocated by speed. German doctrine taught how to control variables, but not to respond to the unpredictable. The DUKWs didn't just cross the Rhine, they drowned out an entire century of European strategic thinking, and no general prepared for Napoleon could defeat an enemy who fought as if he were in the 21st century. This breach was not only military, it was ideological. It was the collapse of a belief in tactical superiority as the dominant force of war. The Americans didn't have the best tanks. They did not have the most charismatic generals. But they had what really counts when war goes global: the ability to do more, faster, and to deliver it where no one expects it. This was the new war, and it could not be overcome with manuals, only with systems. In the Wehrmacht's final reports before the fall of the Rhineland, there is a phrase repeated with variations: "We have failed to establish a line of contention." But what it really says is something deeper. We can't establish logic. Because the enemy had ceased to operate within the bounds of doctrine, he had created a new war, and in doing so, it condemned the previous one to obsolescence. The moral impact of this echoed until the last day of the Reich, because it was not a surrender in combat. It was a real-time autopsy. And if the Germans still believed they could reorganize the defenses, wait for reinforcements or find gaps, all of that disappeared when they realized what was to come next. Because if light vehicles, mobile kitchens, doctors, and radios had already crossed the Rhine, what was about to cross was what German doctrine feared most: something that was not expected to see floating, something that came from the factory straight to the front, and that would transform rivers into steel highways. As the DUKWs advanced down the Rhine, the clash between two philosophies of warfare became evident not only on maps and reports, but in every meter traveled by the amphibious vehicles. On one side, Germany presented the Landwasserschlepper, LWS, an engineering masterpiece, tracked, armored, capable of carrying 20 fully equipped soldiers, resistant to mud, snow, and complex obstacles. Each LWS was the pinnacle of German design, thought to perfection, built with specialized materials and fine-tuned for each operation. But this excellence came at a high price. Producing a unit took weeks, required skilled artisans and rare pieces, often insufficient in number to create large-scale strategic impact. In the German view, the LWS represented war as art, meticulous, precise, and almost sacred in its execution. But in the reality of the Rhine, art did not mean advantage. It meant slowness and limitation. Every combat-ready LWS was a counted number, and every loss was irreparable. On the other side of the spectrum, the American DUKW appeared, apparently simple, improvised in the eyes of traditional European engineering, but revolutionary in practice. Based on a standard truck chassis, equipped with propeller and rudder, moving adjustable tire system, and minimal armor, it could carry 25 men or 5 tons of supplies anywhere on the Rhine, without relying on bridges, floating engineering, or additional support. Each vehicle could be driven by a soldier with minimal training. Standardized components meant that maintenance was possible anywhere with common parts, something the LWS did not allow. The result? More than 2,000 DUKWs ready to cross, multiplying the Allied presence at points that the Germans did not even consider vulnerable. Quantity outweighed quality, but decisively. The irony of the story was in the clash of perspectives. While the German generals prided themselves on their accuracy and refined engineering, the American command understood that in all-out war, replicability and speed trump perfectionism. The DUKWs were not perfect. Some sank, others lost propellers or got bogged down on jagged banks, but the American production line guaranteed immediate replacement, fast patching, almost instant reintegration. The German doctrine provided for controlled failures, solved with ingenuity and time. The Americans predicted massive failures, solved with numbers and redundancy. Each DUKW that arrived on the eastern bank was a reminder that in modern conflict, industrial capability has become a more lethal weapon than any tank or sniper gun. The philosophical difference was clear. artisanal perfection versus massive replication. The Germans sought excellence in a few units, believing that each vehicle could fulfill critical missions optimally. Americans sought good enough in overwhelming numbers, creating redundancy and fluidity. Where the LWS required an experienced commander to operate, the DUKW could be flown by any trained average soldier in hours. Where the LWS stopped for complex repairs, the DUKW was quickly repaired or replaced. And this difference was not limited to vehicle numbers. It reflected the American industrial mindset: standardization, efficiency, adaptability. While the Wehrmacht waited for predictable crossing points, German observers counted how many LWS might appear on an eventual crossing. But DUKWs traversed not in isolated units, but in continuous swarms, bypassing fixed points, saturating lines of observation, and spraying reserves. A German report dated March 25 describes the frustration. Every crossing point we defended was attacked from all sides. There is no center, there is no focus, only flow. No LWS could have done it alone. Only the American logic of massification allowed this doctrine to be irreversible. The psychological effect on the German troops could not be underestimated. Soldiers who had spent weeks defending trenches watched thousands of DUKWs emerge from the river, delivering weapons, ammunition, and food, while the LWS remained a distant rarity. Each successful crossing increased the perception of inevitability. Germany was not only losing territory, it was witnessing the bankruptcy of its military philosophy. The DUKW turned the impossible into routine, numerical disadvantage into strategic advantage. The enemy was no longer fighting individual vehicles but an entire system, a chain of logistics, engineering, and production impossible to disrupt. American industrial superiority was not limited to the DUKWs. Each river unit was accompanied by strategic supplies: ammunition for artillery, fuel for armor, radio, and direct communication with mobile command headquarters. The continuous flow allowed simultaneous and decentralized operations. An American commander could send a battalion forward with enough ammunition and ration, knowing that another contingent would arrive within minutes with additional reinforcement. LWS, as sophisticated as it was, could not be replicated at a similar scale and speed. The war was being decided not in individual combats but in production capacity, standardization, and coordinated execution. And at the center of this philosophical contrast was the Rhine, an ancient symbol of German defensive strength. Where Reich engineers envisioned an insurmountable barrier, the Americans created multiple logistics corridors, using medium but numerous vehicles. German perfection lost out in the face of American abundance. Each DUKW that crossed the river was a silent reminder that modern warfare would not be won by perfect weapons, but by systems that work en masse and without hesitation. Each unit crossing the Rhine carried men, supplies, and a lesson. Replicability trumps perfection, speed trumps tradition, production trumps isolated design. The irony of this story is that the solution was before German eyes. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. Because the next phase of the operation would not only be about river crossing, it would be about how these amphibious vehicles became mobile logistics hubs, connecting flanks, feeding airborne troops, and turning the Rhine into a highway of continuous offensive. And by the time German officers finally understood what was happening, it was too late. The war logic that had underpinned decades of strategy had been irreversibly outdated. As the DUKWs advanced down the Rhine, crossing currents and ignoring barriers that had been considered insurmountable for centuries, a silent, invisible army played the most decisive role in the war. They were not in uniform. They did not wield weapons. They did not occupy positions of command. But without them, no American plan could have been executed with the observed precision and scale. They were the workers at the Pontiac, Detroit, and Cleveland plants, the engineers, welders, women, and immigrants who turned steel, engines, and propellers into amphibious vehicles capable of crossing rivers and fueling offensives. Every riveting, every engine adjustment, every hull tightness test was an act of resistance against the Third Reich, an invisible operation that replaced the noise of machine guns with the rhythm of the assembly lines. On those production lines, work was not just industrial, it was moral and strategic. Men and women aware that every DUKW produced could save lives and reduce wartime, operated with a quiet urgency. American efficiency was not the work of generals, but of ordinary citizens who turned the factory into a battlefront. While the Wehrmacht calculated crossing points, assessed its artillery and prepared reserves, each DUKW that went down the Rhine carried with it the work of hundreds of workers who would never be recognized on field maps or military medals, but whose contribution decided the war as much as any troop or cannon. German intelligence reports captured after the surrender reveal the total underestimation of this human component. Third Reich analysts focused only on vehicles and assault operations, ignoring that the real American advantage came from its continuous, standardized production capability. While German engineers sought craftsmanship perfection in limited units, American civilians produced thousands of functional vehicles in weeks. Each DUKW was an extension of an industrial philosophy applied to war. Replication, standardization, redundancy, all done on a scale unimaginable to Reich analysts. The magnitude of this effort is difficult to comprehend without numbers. During the peak of production, General Motors manufactured about 525 DUKWs per month, each unit costing approximately $10,950. Considering the components shared with standard CCKW trucks, 750 units produced over the course of the war, American logistics turned what was once an obstacle into an absolute advantage. While a German LWS required months and highly skilled craftsmen, the DUKW could be produced in days by workers trained for efficiency and speed. Every weld, every tightness test, every engine tuned was an indirect blow to the Wehrmacht, showing that modern warfare was decided not only by tactics or bravery, but by industrial mobilization capacity. The irony of the situation was evident. The Germans expected to face perfect, rare vehicles capable of standing up to their millennial defenses. What they found were thousands of average but mass-produced DUKWs, operating as a swarm, ignoring geography and doctrine. Each crossing was sustained by an invisible industrial ecosystem: assembly lines, constant supplies, streamlined maintenance, and abundant labor. The American advantage was not in the individual sophistication of each vehicle, but in the ability to sustain a full operation on a continuous scale. The Rhine became an avenue of logistical movement, but that avenue only existed because civilian workers in Detroit and Pontiac turned steel and tires into a continuous stream of offensive. The accounts of American veterans highlight this contrast. Many remember the moment when they received DUKWs in their sectors and realized that each vehicle represented hours of work for civilians who would never see the battlefield. "You could feel the human effort inside the car," said a sergeant in the 51st Highland Division. Each DUKW was not just transportation, it was the will of millions of Americans crossing the Rhine with us. This awareness increased the morale of the troops, transforming logistics into a psychological weapon. The war was not just direct confrontation, it was a demonstration of collective power, of an entire nation operating in invisible synchrony. The comparison with the German effort reveals even more the philosophical contrast. While Reich engineers tried to develop small series of amphibious vehicles, refined, highly specialized, and impossible to produce in significant quantities, the Americans applied the factory logic: good enough, replicated en masse. The DUKW might not be the best amphibious vehicle individually, but in numbers, presence, and serviceability, it vastly surpassed the LWS. Each lost unit could be replaced quickly, and each success strengthened the operation as a whole. The war had become, at this point, an extension of the production lines, and not just the battlefield. And this industrial extension transformed the strategy in real time. German troops, awaiting predictable attacks, watched in disbelief as swarms of DUKWs emerged at multiple points on the Rhine, delivering supplies, weapons, and troops to where German doctrine did not even allow us to think. The surprise factor wasn't just tactical, it was industrial. Each crossing was the embodiment of the invisible labor of American civilians, whose psychological and strategic impact devastated the German defense in ways that no cannon could. In the midst of this operation, the morale of the American and British troops increased. The knowledge that they were being backed by a gigantic, uninterrupted, reliable industrial force created confidence and boldness. It wasn't just about crossing a river, it was about crossing obstacles that, for the Germans, were sacred and inviolable. while benefiting from a continuous supply of vehicles, weapons, and supplies. Each DUKW was a line of communication, transportation, and morale, a physical symbol of the power of American production. As the Rhine ceased to be a barrier and became a highway, the impact of civilian labor became clear. Without Pontiac's workmen, there would not be enough DUKWs to saturate the eastern bank, to maintain a steady flow of supplies, or to create multiple simultaneous crossing points. Each soldier who emerged from the river carried with him more than weapons. He carried the execution of hundreds of hours of engineering, welding, assembly, and testing, performed by civilians who would never enter trenches. This reality demonstrated that in modern wars, the front line is not only geographical, but also industrial. And as the Germans watched in bewilderment as the seemingly endless advance, accounts from captured officers underlined the incomprehension. "They have vehicles that just won't stop," said a German infantry major. "They appear at all points, transporting men, food, ammunition. There are no centers, there are no fixed targets. We don't know where to strike." What he didn't realize was that these vehicles didn't rely solely on tactical capability. They depended on thousands of American civilians working overtime, replacing losses, keeping the operation alive. Without this industrial base, every crossing would have been impossible. And so, as the Rhine ceased to be sacred and turned into an avenue, the workers of Pontiac, Detroit, and Cleveland became the true unsung heroes of the operation. They were not ahead, they did not receive medals, but each DUKW that emerged from the water carried with it the collective strength of a nation. The victory over Hitler began in the factories and culminated in the crossing of the Rhine. And if the world were paying attention, it would understand that without these civilians, the March 1945 operation would never have happened with the speed and effectiveness that changed the course of the war. And when the German generals finally realized the scale of what they were facing, not an army limited by fixed points in time, but an assembly line materialized in continuous motion, there was no strategy or counterattack that worked. The war at this point was not just of soldiers against soldiers. It was the battle between mentalities. Artisanal perfectionism versus industrial replication, military tradition versus logistical innovation. And the conclusion of this battle would be revealed in the next few days, when the crossing would be consolidated, and the Wehrmacht would understand that the Rhine could no longer save them. As the DUKWs continued to emerge from the Rhine in an almost endless stream, a quiet transformation took place in the German lines. They were not explosions, nor direct attacks, nor meticulously planned sieges that demoralized the soldiers. It was the simple impossibility of reacting effectively. Exhausted troops, positioned in bunkers and trenches, began to realize that all the crossing points they had prepared were useless. Accounts from captured soldiers describe moments of incredulity. Officers watching DUKWs carrying infantry, ammunition, food, and medical equipment, crossing the river without the support of bridges, without waiting for engineers, without respecting the established defensive lines. One soldier wrote, "If they drive down the Rhine, it's over." That sentence summed up the moral erosion that was taking place in real time, a silent confession of powerlessness in the face of American innovation. The silence became as eloquent as any cannon. Unlike traditional battles, where the exchange of fire defines the course of action, here the Wehrmacht found itself paralyzed not by physical force, but by the impossibility of identifying critical targets. Each once predictable crossing point was now just one of countless sites where DUKWs emerged, saturating observatories, confusing artillery, and derailing any coordinated response. Officers reported trying to locate traditional beachheads, only to find that they did not exist. Enemy troops were dispersed, infiltrated, and supplied in a way that German doctrine could not count. Each DUKW it cruised carried supplies, reinforcements, and a silent reminder of American superiority, not just in numbers, but in operational conception. The psychology of war was being completely reconfigured. Soldiers who had trained to repel invaders at fixed points now watched amphibious vehicles bypass all defensive engineering, delivering men, weapons, and supplies at any accessible point on the river. The terror came not from the fire, but from the realization that nothing they had prepared would work. Officers tried to maintain discipline, but psychological panic spread like an electric current. Troops dropping their arms, surrendering without formal fighting, and resistance traditionally fierce began to fragment. Each capture report mentioned confusion, incredulity, and resignation. And at the heart of this breakdown was the lesson of industrial power. DUKWs were average individually but numerous and reliable in scale. Where the Wehrmacht saw obstacles, Americans saw avenues. Where the Germans calculated possible losses, the Americans compensated with industrial redundancy. Each lost or damaged vehicle did not interrupt the operation. Each crossing was replaced by another, maintaining a continuous flow. The presence of hundreds of DUKWs on a broad front turned the war into a show of capability, a show of force so ruthless that the Wehrmacht could not confront it directly. The psychological impact went beyond mere military strategy. German soldiers, accustomed to conventional attacks, now witnessed a concept of warfare that was completely alien to them. Floating supply lines, troops surging at multiple points, supplies arriving while their guns failed to locate targets. An officer wrote in his diary, "We can no longer react. They are everywhere and nowhere. It is not just a defeat. It's like we're fighting against an industrial spectrum." Each DUKW thus became not just a vehicle, but a symbol of inevitability, the embodiment of an American capability that the Wehrmacht never conceived. The German silence also reflected the loss of agency. Troops that had previously reacted to enemy actions were now forced to watch, helplessly, as the enemy moved at will. Each crossing of the Rhine dismantled the logic of defense that had sustained years of doctrine. Where they had planned strategic barriers, they found scattered flows. Where pressure points were waiting, they found multiple lines of infiltration. Where they calculated advantage, they found inevitability. The war did not have to be ended with one shot. The demonstration of capacity was enough to paralyze and morally disarm the adversary. This psychological breakdown had immediate effects on decision-making. German commandos could not react in real time. Reserves, designed to concentrate firepower against fixed bridgeheads, remained motionless, awaiting orders that never came. Each DUKW, moving troops and supplies independently, became a mobile pressure center, making it impossible to concentrate German forces. American logistical speed not only supplied units in combat, but created new fronts on which the enemy was unable to reorganize, making every defensive action irrelevant. The narrative of the crossings reveals that modern warfare transcends direct confrontation. It was not just about men, tanks, or artillery, but complex systems in which industrial production, engineering, and tactical innovation combined to produce decisive effect. The German silence was not mere weariness. It was an unconscious recognition of powerlessness in the face of an operation conceived with a multidimensional vision. Each DUKW emerging from the Rhine was a lesson for the Third Reich. Production capacity can override tradition. Continuous flow can replace planning, and a seemingly simple innovation can destroy decades of military doctrine. Soldiers and officers reported surreal scenes. Infantry surrendering at the sight of amphibious vehicles carrying full soldiers, supplies, and heavy weapons without relying on bridges. Gunners calculating shots at coordinates that changed at every moment. Intelligence officers trying to locate the main line of advance only to realize that it did not exist. A German major confessed, "They don't attack the bridge, they cross. At all points. There is no center, there is no focus. We have no answers." This realization encapsulated the psychological efficacy of the DUKWs. Defeat without direct confrontation, paralysis without traditional battle. While the Wehrmacht was crumbling morally, the Americans maintained an uninterrupted flow. Troops received supplies, wounded were evacuated, and airborne units were supplied directly, in synchronization with crossings. Each DUKW operated as an autonomous and coordinated cell, simultaneously bolstering logistics, morale, and offensive capabilities. Logistical innovation became a psychological and strategic weapon, showing that modern warfare could be won by demonstrating operational efficiency, without the need to destroy each point of resistance with gunfire or explosions. And when the Germans finally realized the scale and continuity of the advance, the effect was overwhelming. There were no immediate retaliation strategies. There were no precise counterattacks. Only silence, confusion, and increasing surrender. Troops dropped their weapons, officers resigned, and the defensive logic that had underpinned decades of planning evaporated in the face of evidence that DUKWs were not just vehicles. They were expressions of an industrial capability that was impossible to combat with conventional methods. What the generals of the Third Reich did not understand at that time was that the war would not be limited to bridges or rivers. Each DUKW crossing the Rhine transformed the theater of operations, creating new avenues, feeding airborne troops, and shifting lines of defense. The demonstration of efficiency and scale functioned as a weapon of demoralization, and the silence that followed was more eloquent than any shot or explosion. The Wehrmacht was, for the first time, facing an enemy that not only fought but redefined the rules of war as the battle raged. And as American observers continued to tally crossings, German troops surrendered, strategic depots were captured without resistance, and defensive plans became irrelevant. The Rhine, once a sacred barrier, became an open avenue. The next stage would reveal the full extent of this logistical revolution. Not just river crossing, but the consolidation of supplies, troops, and armaments that would hasten the end of the war and prove that industrial supremacy had silenced the enemy long before the last shot. As the last DUKWs disappeared into the fog of the German morning, it was not just the Rhine that had been crossed, but an invisible frontier of modern warfare. What began as a tactical operation turned into an industrial lesson that would transcend decades and continents. American and Allied military analysts immediately realized that they were not just facing an enemy, they were demonstrating a new paradigm. War could be won by production, scale, and logistics, as much as by courage or classical strategic planning. Where the Wehrmacht relied on rivers, bridges, and choke points, the Americans relied on assembly lines, standardized parts, and flexible training, multiplying the effect of each DUKW into a continuous crescendo of mobility and supply. The operational impact was visible in every field report. More than 15,000 soldiers transported, 1,200 vehicles, 3,000 tons of supplies delivered, and 2,000 wounded evacuated in just 72 hours. Each DUKW, individually modest, contributed to an unbroken network that pulverized German defensive logic. Where they expected concentrated resistance, they encountered strategic dispersal, surprise infiltration, and supplies arriving before any orders were even executed. German intelligence, which had carefully recorded each DUKW in previous operations, could not believe the scale. More than 2,000 amphibious vehicles in simultaneous operation, when they had estimated only 100. The difference between prediction and reality was abysmal, a cruel illustration of what the Wehrmacht called impossibility, rivers that became roads and troops that appeared where they shouldn't be. If you were surprised by the size of this operation, share your reaction in the comments. Absolute power, unbelievable, logistics wins. The philosophical legacy of the DUKW goes beyond maps and war diaries. NATO, in studying post-war river operations, has incorporated the lesson that natural barriers do not guarantee defense without the support of industrialization and mobility. The Marshall Plan, while both civil and economic, reflected the same logic. Supplies at scale, standardization, and speed could rebuild nations, just as crossing rivers defeated armies. North American highway systems and the logistical infrastructure supporting military operations derived directly from the production mindset exemplified by DUKWs. The Cold War, with its constant maneuvering and readiness, drank from the same philosophy. Winning was not just about destroying enemies, but about ensuring that the flow of resources, personnel, and equipment was superior in consistency and scale, creating strategic inevitability. German soldiers and civilians watched in silence as American efficiency, puzzled by the ease with which the impossible became routine. Troops who envisioned the Rhine as an impassable fortress witnessed an army crossing the river without relying on bridges, engineers, or sequential planning. Each DUKW that emerged carried not just soldiers or supplies, but a clear message: industrial superiority can defeat any geographical or doctrinal obstacle. Captured officers admitted that it wasn't just fighting strength that was missing. It was imagination to conceive of an operation of this magnitude. The war, in its final weeks, was not just fought by soldiers, tanks, or artillery, but by assembly lines and intelligent production systems. The impact also extended to the enemy's morale and perception. German civilians, accustomed to shortages and strict discipline, saw organized forces with almost mechanical precision. Soldiers receiving hot food, medics transporting the wounded without delay, continuous communication, and supplies arriving almost magically. This efficiency had a devastating psychological effect. eroding the will to resist and transforming war into a demonstration of industrial capacity, where each military action was amplified by the scale of production. The DUKW, a simple and apparently improvised vehicle, became a symbol of a war where organization and quantity supplanted tradition and craftsmanship. Every element of the Rhine crossing demonstrated the convergence of logistics, engineering, and strategy. Airborne troops were supplied directly by DUKWs, while vehicles floated along the banks carrying food, ammunition, and medical equipment. Engineers could focus on critical reinforcements, knowing that the basic supply continued to flow without interruption. Where the Wehrmacht calculated fixed points of defense, the American flow was dynamic and unpredictable. Modern warfare, it was shown, is not just a battle of fire, but a battle of systems, of the ability to keep troops supplied, mobile, and coordinated at any point of operation. And this industrial mentality would become a reference for future conflicts. The notion that natural barriers could be bypassed with logistical innovation influenced NATO doctrine, which began to prioritize mobility, redundancy, and supplies at scale over fixed positions and choke points. War came to be seen as an engineering problem. The greater the ability to produce, transport, and sustain operations, the greater the likelihood of success. The Rhine of 1945 thus became a permanent case study. Industry as a fighting force, planning as an extension of production, and innovation as a strategic advantage. As the DUKWs finalized their crossings, the Wehrmacht remained disoriented, unable to react to the full scale of the operation. Each vehicle was testimony that modern warfare does not depend on individual bravery, nor on consolidated military tradition, but on the ability to organize, replicate, and sustain forces on a large scale. German officials later admitted they could never have imagined that an army could cross rivers as if they were streets, keeping supplies and reinforcements without interruption, at hundreds of points simultaneously. The silence and surrender that followed were not only strategic, were a direct consequence of industrial superiority. DUKW, in its simplicity, encapsulated a philosophy: good enough, but enough in number to make obstacles irrelevant. The American model, based on standardized production, flexible training, and logistical thinking, overcame German perfectionism, which limited the number of operating units. Where the Reich invested in highly sophisticated but scarce units, the U.S. multiplied reliable, easy-to-operate, and quickly replaceable vehicles. This difference in approach determined not only the success on the Rhine, but accelerated the general collapse of German forces in the West. In reflecting on the impact, historians agree that the crossing of the Rhine redefined warfare. It was no longer just a matter of isolated battles, direct confrontation, or classic maneuvers. It was a systemic operation where each DUKW was part of a logistical organism capable of neutralizing defenses, supplying troops, and influencing morale simultaneously. What was impossible on paper became everyday in practice, and the enemy only realized too late that defeat came not only from gunfire or tanks, but from the consistent application of organized industrial capability. And so, as long as the DUKWs continued to transport men, weapons, and supplies, the crossing of the Rhine cemented itself as a paradigm. The enemy could plan, fortify, and calculate, but could not counter the scale of production and American logistical innovation. The legacy was clear. In modern warfare, brute force is secondary to the ability to maintain an uninterrupted flow of resources and mobility, and the production mentality has become, in itself, a decisive weapon. The next final chapter of the story will reveal the synthesis of all these elements, showing how industry, innovation, and logistics turned the impossible into routine and ended one of the most mythical defenses in military history. As the last DUKWs emerged from the Rhine, dripping with water and leaving trails that disappeared into the morning mist, it was clear that the myth of the Holy River that had protected Germany for millennia had been shattered, not by the strength of tanks, the courage of soldiers, or traditional strategic calculation, but by industrial power concentrated in thousands of simple, replicable vehicles. The Wehrmacht, trained to face classic crossings and defend bridges, saw its doctrines crumble in the face of logistics that operated on multiple fronts, without waiting, without bridges, without limits. The collapse was complete. Soldiers abandoning positions, reserves without a target, communications disrupted, and German leaders recognizing in captivity that they were prepared for the wrong war. The central thesis proved itself. The Rhine was not defeated by fire but by organized American industry, logistical planning, and the daring to use scale as a weapon. The universal lesson of this operation goes far beyond March 1945. In war, as in economics or life, the ability to sustain operations, provide resources, and maintain continuous mobility often trumps tactical excellence or theoretical planning. Volume conquers perfection. Replicability triumphs over rarity. Innovation applied to mass production turns the impossible into routine. Every DUKW, every assembly line in Pontiac or Detroit, proved that modern warfare belongs not only to the great heroes or the classical strategists, but to the systems that can articulate people, machines, and ideas in a continuous symphony of efficiency. Industrial supremacy thus became the real decisive weapon. German Field Marshal Walter Model himself, in words captured after the surrender, summed it up with an almost ironic sincerity. "We have been defeated by swimming trucks, not because of the courage of the enemy, but because of the quantity and organization. The Rhine has ceased to exist for us." This admission encapsulates the historical irony of the entire operation and reinforces the need to reflect on the role of production and logistics in any conflict. If you were surprised by these facts, leave your like and subscribe to support the research and the search for historical truth. Comment on the most shocking fact you discovered in the video, and activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact that we are going to reveal. And while the DUKWs disappear in the memory of the war, the bridge to the future is already being built. Don't go yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story, and see how innovation, ingenuity, and production can once again transform the destiny of nations and define the course of history.